I'd like to begin by we are recording. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet, the Wurundjeri people, and I pay my respects to their elders, past and present. So I'm Linda Miles. I'm talking to you from Melbourne today, but normally based in Perth in Western Australia. I look after the Australian Energy and Low Carbon Transition Portfolio for Scottish Development International, who most of you know, but we're the trade and investment agency for the Scottish Government. And we've also got Kevin Liu, who leads the APAC team. He's also dialing in and is on today. It's fantastic to see so many people online. So there's obviously a lot of interest in what's happening with offshore wind in Australia. And I'm joined by three fantastic presenters from the offshore wind industry in Australia to talk more specifically about Victoria. We're recording the session and we'll be sending the recording and the slides afterwards. And there'll be time for questions at the end. But if you'd like to use the chat box during the presentations, if you'd like to ask something or comment as we go along. So offshore wind is in its infancy in Australia, and significant offshore wind zones have been identified with a capacity totaling 40 gigawatts. In late 2021, the Federal Parliament passed the Offshore Electricity Infrastructure Bill, paving the way for offshore wind projects to be constructed in Australian waters. The first set of draft regulations have been released, with the consultation process open until the 22nd of April 2022. All feedback is welcome. And yesterday, the government declared that a region of the Bass Strait, off the Victorian Gippsland coast, will be the first priority area for the development of offshore wind projects. And I'm sure our speakers will all be very excited about this. So over to our first speaker, Vanya Kumar, who is the Executive Director, Commercial and Investment Attraction for Energy at the Victorian Government's Department of Environment, Land, Water and Planning. Over to you, Vanya.
Thank you so much, Linda, for that lovely introduction. And can I please also start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands on which we're meeting and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and to the elders of any other communities who may be here with us. And like Linda, I think we're in many, many different time zones. So I might just start by saying good afternoon, but I know many of you are early in the morning. So if we could go to the next slide. Earlier this month, the Victorian government published the Victorian Offshore Wind Policy Directions paper, which outlines the Victorian government's ambitious plans to establish a thriving offshore wind sector in Victoria, which is one of the southern states in this country. The paper outlines how our state will accelerate the growth of the state's offshore wind industry, create thousands of new jobs, generate economic opportunities for Victorians, and also, excuse me for just one moment, and support our transition to renewables and towards our target of net zero emissions by 2050. As part of this announcement, we have committed to a 2032 offshore wind target for Victoria of at least 2 gigawatts following a competitive process. That's enough to power 1.5 million homes here, and we've set ambitious targets of 4 gigawatts and 9 gigawatts for 2035 and 2040 respectively. So it's an almost a 20-year vision statement. Setting a long-term vision for offshore wind now provides Victoria the strategic opportunity to build a thriving industry and deliver investment certainty, forge new supply chains and secure our future energy supply. The government is now planning a consultation process to engage with a broad range of stakeholders, including traditional owners, local communities and the industry on the policy directions paper and our approach to establishing offshore wind. Later in 2022, we are expected to release an implementation statement, and this will follow on from the consultation. It is a statement and not a plan, and really it's intended to give a little more direction in respect of some of the transmission issues and some of the ports issues. If we could please go to the next slide. Thank you. So we are really conscious that our net zero target is a driving force for how we're looking at our economy. DELP, which is the Department of Environment, Land, Water and Planning, has modelled the economy-wide demand projections to estimate Victoria's energy requirements in 2050. And what we know is that we will need 3 to 6 times the energy that we consume today by that time. We think, or we understand, that the forecast increase in electricity demand is driven by replacing fossil fuel resources with renewable electricity. And this includes for road transport, diesel rail replacement, building and water heating, industrial processes, shipping and aviation fuels, among other things. If we could go to the next slide, please. What we're seeing, and I think everybody on this call will be well and truly aware of this, is we are seeing a global growth in the offshore wind industry. We're really conscious that, you know, we're seeing significant increases across the board in North America, in Latin America, Europe, and indeed in Asia. And really, we see ourselves as part of that. If we could go to the next slide, please. So how did we come to this? Over the last year and a half, DELP has done a huge amount of work to get to a position where we have announced our offshore wind strategy and the targets. We commissioned a series of technical studies to investigate the potential for offshore wind to contribute to Victoria's net zero emissions targets. And these reports have informed the offshore wind policy directions paper. We think the resource here in Victoria is up to 13 gigawatts for fixed platform offshore wind, while floating offshore wind turbines can represent an even greater opportunity. On the screen before you, you're seeing some of the reports that have underpinned our investigation. And part of this has included the zones. And I know there have been some announcements this week in respect of the first of those potential declared zones by the Commonwealth Government, and that is in Gippsland, off the Victorian coast in the Bass Strait. So for us, that really represents a really important development for the Victorian offshore wind industry, and indeed the Australian offshore wind industry. Next slide, please. We also think that near those zones, and this is what you're seeing on this slide, there's a really big opportunity for local employment and local economic opportunities. And as I think many people on the call would be aware, local content often forms part of some of these really big projects that we do here in Victoria. We see this as a great opportunity for Victoria to collaborate with many overseas companies and experts, and to bring some of that learning to our shores. And I hope some of the people on this call will be looking to come and see sort of the advantages that we already have in Victoria with our great infrastructure, great skilled local workforce, and indeed great opportunity to sort of expand into Victoria as a base of operations for not just for Australian offshore wind, but even potentially for New Zealand and for the Asia Pacific region. Next slide, please. So one of the big things for Victoria and indeed all Australian jurisdictions is social license. It is something that is important for us, and part of our offshore wind consultation is really about making sure we understand what the needs of local communities, traditional owners, residents, local residents, and community groups they need as part of this development. We are intending to engage early and meaningfully, and our community engagement commences alongside our industry engagement in April this year. We will be looking to prioritise hiring labour from local communities and involving direct local communities. And previous onshore auctions for renewable energy have included a very strong local content or local industry development component. And on this slide also is for those who are interested in engaging with us for our industry and community consultation work. There's a website where you can register, or there's an email address and a website where you can register your interest. So please do reach out and register your interest for that. Next slide, please. So I mentioned earlier that the Victorian government will release the offshore wind implementation statement later in 2022. This statement will provide further guidance, and it's really going to provide further guidance on sort of three things: the scale and timing of the procurement for the first offshore wind tranche, the Victorian government's approach to the transmission solutions, and our approach to the ports infrastructure solutions. We see that providing these details to industry and the community early will be meaningful for everyone and will enable us to identify early issues. We are well aware that there are projects already in development, and knowing some of these things will help the developers of those projects, but will also help communities and local residents understand what is happening in their backyard. Next slide, please. So we have a very long timeline, and that is that we will have at least 2 gigawatts of offshore wind capacity online by 2032. And really this is to allow both a really robust competitive process, but to allow developers to have sufficient time to go through planning and approvals, procurement, the supply chain and workforce development issues. Obviously, the Commonwealth's regulatory framework is still being developed, and to make sure that enabling infrastructure such as ports and transmission is able to be realised in conjunction with the offshore wind farms themselves. We know that a number of developers have started doing their early work, and late last year, through the Victorian Government's Energy Innovation Fund, we provided support to 3 offshore wind projects to do some of that development work, and they were Star of the South, Macquarie Group, and Flotation Energy. Tim, I beg your pardon, flotation has not been spelt correctly there. But we are really keen to engage with others as well who haven't been supported through the Energy Innovation Fund, but who are interested at looking at Victoria as a possible location for developments. Linda, I might stop there because I think that will give the other speakers a chance to provide their perspective on some of this as well.
Thank you so much, Vanya. That was really comprehensive, and I'm sure there's a lot of interest in what's happening from the Victoria side. So next we have one of the operators. So we have Katrina Langdon, who's Industry Development and Procurement Manager for the Star of the South project. So that's the most progressed of the almost 20 proposed offshore wind projects in Australia. So over to you, Katrina, to give us an update. Thank you.
Thanks, Linda. Let me just try and share my screen. How am I going there? Is it sharing?
Yes, that's great. We can see that.
Okay. Sorry, I'm not sure how to put it on full Preso mode, but we'll start. My name's Katrina Langdon, and I'm the Industry Development and Procurement Manager at Star of the South. I just wanted to start off by saying that we acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we meet today, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay our respects to their elders past, present and future. Now, I understand we've got a lot of international people on the call, so I thought we'd do a quick geography lesson so that we all knew where we were talking about. So we've got Australia here. So when we talk about the Commonwealth Government, we're talking about the government that looks after all of Australia. Star of the South is located down here in Victoria, down in the bottom right. Also important on this map to note is that the little red lines denote our grid. So the grid is not everywhere, I suppose, is the message, and it's very stringy and it's very centred around where the major metropolitan areas are. So Star of the South is quite near to Melbourne down here. And also the grid is split into two different parts in Australia. We've got the NEM on the right-hand side, National Electricity Market, which is completely separate to the side where Perth is. They have the Swiss on the left-hand side. So also why offshore wind in Australia, and I think Vanya had some really good points in her presentation, but essentially it's a new technology. It's a really big scale renewable energy investment. Most of the onshore projects in Australia are big projects around 500 megawatts to a gig, whereas the offshore projects are generally much larger than that, which means that you have less transmission online if you have one big project as opposed to many smaller projects. So to give you a bit of a background on Star of the South, what it is. So we're located, this is Victoria here, and Star of the South is located off the coast of Gippsland. We've got a project area of about 500 kilometres squared. The project size is, we're looking up to 2.2 gigawatts in size. And as I said, that's a very large size for an Australian project. Big projects are generally that 500 to a gig. So up to 200 turbines, depending on the turbine size. Turbines now are getting bigger every day, but the big ones are around 15 megawatts to 18 megawatts is what we think will be the case by the time we get to procurement stage. We're looking at landfall here at Reeves Beach in the Gippsland region. Our project is a little bit unique in that we have an underground transmission line for about 75 kilometres, which connects into the Latrobe Valley, which was intended to connect into the Latrobe Valley. Here we've got a picture of the team. So we have about 50 people working on the project at this point. Most of the people are in our approvals team working on our environmental and other approvals. So I'm sure you're all aware of the basics of an offshore wind farm. You've got the turbines. We're a fixed bottom project. We've got quite shallow waters off the coast. Nearest turbine is about 7 kilometres off the coast, and furthest turbine's about 25 kilometres off the coast. So it will be visible from the land, and we're just currently releasing our 3D model of visualisation of what that may look like, and beginning our consultation with stakeholders using that 3D model. We've just got a fancy new computer in the Yarram office, which allows stakeholders to come and have a look about what it will look like from different perspectives. So you've got the turbines offshore, fixed bottom with a monopole foundation is the current school of thought. Array cables connecting to the offshore substation, and then export cables, the red. Hit landfall, we're likely to have 1 or 2 substations offshore and then connecting into the Latrobe Valley. So this is following on from what Vanya said. We've been receiving some very good news for offshore wind, and there's quite a lot of momentum in Australia at the moment. So first of all, last year we had the federal government, Commonwealth government, release the Offshore Electricity Infrastructure Bill. This is Angus Taylor on the right here, our federal energy minister. And on the left here, we have our CEO and Erin, our Chief Development Officer, presenting at one of the Senate hearings. So that was a major milestone for the industry, and that bill or that act will allow proponents like Star of the South to get exclusivity over the site area, which is really important. Without that legislation, there is no industry. In the middle here, as Vanya said, we were very fortunate to receive from the Victorian government a grant under the Energy Innovation Fund. And this is Dan Andrews, the Victorian Premier, announcing that grant. And under the grant, there's a lot of activities we'll be doing, but the big ticket items are our onshore geotech and our offshore geotech, and some other workforce studies and supply chain studies and some environmental studies, and a few stakeholder consultation pieces of work as well. So more good news came in the last few weeks, which is what Vanya was mentioning, is the Victorian government has released its offshore wind policy directions paper with these targets here, which the 2.2 or the 2 gigawatts here lines up very nicely with Star of the South with a maximum project size of 2.2 gigs. So this is very exciting for our industry and for Star of the South. And then again this week we've got further good news. Under the federal government has announced that Gippsland will be the first area of priority under the Offshore Electricity Infrastructure Act, and that's where Star of the South and Flotation Energy are located. So really good momentum and really positive announcements coming from both levels of government, certainly for our project. Now, what have we been working on? So Star of the South is probably the most mature offshore wind project in Australia. Back in 2019, we received an exploration license, which is a bespoke instrument because there was nothing available at the time that suited offshore wind. And that allows us to do our environmental and other studies in our project area. So we kicked that off in 2019. We've also started doing our floating LiDAR surveys to measure the wind and the waves in the project area. In 2020, we would continue to do the surveys. And then in 2021, the surveys started to continued and we're nearing the end. And we started to receive that really good news from the federal government and from Victorian government about the legislation and the grant. And just this week, we've had some other big things happening at Star of the South. So the onshore geotech that I mentioned under the Energy Innovation Fund grant, we've got through the procurement phase and we just kicked off on-site activities on Monday. And this is a photo from the induction down at our Yarram office. So the contractor that we've selected to do that work is Douglas Partners, which is a local geotechnical firm. And then also this week, we were lucky enough to go down to Morwell, which is in the Gippsland region, to talk with the local education providers. So we've got TAFE Gippsland, Federation TAFE, Federation Uni, together with Energy Australia Lawn and one of our consultants, Atlas Professionals. So we've been in the background mapping out what kind of skills and courses and training we would need for offshore wind in Australia. And we were sharing those learnings with the local training providers. And equally, they're doing a lot of work in the background as well. So we're doing a lot of information exchange and learning a lot from each other. So we're just meeting periodically to keep each other up to date and working together on these projects. And then we were also lucky enough, Energy Australia Lawn offered a site tour of one of the coal power station that's slated next to close, which is the Yallourn Power Station. It's slated to close in 2028. So as Vanya mentioned, we've got really strong workforce capabilities within the Gippsland region, especially from coal, and those brown coal assets are looking to retire over the next 10 to 15 years. So we've got this great workforce and we're trying to find ways where we can transfer those skills over to offshore wind and give people opportunities in the offshore wind industry. So as a team, we wanted to understand exactly the work environment that people in coal work in, what they're familiar with, and then understand how that would be different if they're in offshore wind so that we can target our discussions with them around that. In particular, it's clear that when you're working in coal, you're working directly for the owner generally, and you obviously work at one site and for a long period of time. So in offshore wind, generally you would work for a contractor of the proponent or the developer, like Star of the South. So that's one of the major differences that we've found. As Vanya mentioned, social license is really important in Australia, and we really put a lot of effort and emphasis on our community engagement. So we have an office down in Yarram, which is in the Gippsland, which is near our project site. And we've got our team down in the Yarram office that are accessible. We also do a lot of community outreach and attend a lot of community events. They're very open to talking about our project and offshore wind more generally. In actual fact today, and I think right now, our community advisory group is down looking at our landfall area at Reeves Beach. So they're getting a tour of our site to understand more about the project. And again, as Vanya said, jobs and investment is a really important part of the offshore wind story and what it can bring to the local regions within Victoria, and also in particular the region we're talking about, which Latrobe Valley and Gippsland, with a lot of coal coming out of the system in the next few years. It's especially important that we find ways to support supply chain and workforce and see how we can maximise the opportunity for them in offshore wind. So our project, as Vanya's slide said, is looking to employ up to 2,000 Victorians during construction. Locally, that's about 760 Gippslanders during construction and about 200 during the operations and maintenance phase. We're part of the Grow Gippsland network, and Grow Gippsland have been super supportive of us and helping us engage with local suppliers and understand the local supply chain landscape. We also have a procurement policy of a tiered approach to our procurement. So when we're looking to procure, and certainly even in the smaller packages that we're doing with the geotech, but when we move into the larger packages, we've got a preference for tier 1 of Gippsland, then focused on the rest of Victoria, the rest of Australia, New Zealand, and then international. It's the way our pricing tables are set up, and it's part of our selection criteria. So I suppose the message for those on the line that are overseas is that we're serious about local content, and we're serious about Gippsland content. So we're looking to try and make connections with local suppliers and overseas tier 1s and big contractors to see how they can maximise that local content, and understanding that that work starts very early. So that's the work we're kicking off this year. So the ICN Gateway is a tool that is partly sponsored by the government. It's a gateway or an entry point for most major projects in Australia, and we also have an ICN Gateway where Australian companies are able to register interest in the project. Star of the South has over 500 companies that have registered interest in our general expression of interest. But later this year, we're going to look to do a more specific expression of interest process where we list specific categories of items where people can self-select against those categories. So that might be something that people on the call are interested in looking out for. It'll be advertised through ICN, but also through our LinkedIn page. So in terms of timing, just the general, takes a long time to build an offshore wind farm. We're still here in feasibility and development. But in all honesty, after all the announcements that have been made in the last 6 months, we're edging closer to this dot, which is financial close. So our target financial close date for the project is 2025, with us assuming we can receive all our approvals by the end of 2024. It's very ambitious, but you have to have a target, and we're certainly positive that we can strive towards that 2025 financial close date. Construction period is a 3 to 5 year period, with the onshore taking a little bit less time than the offshore. And then the O&M period is 25 to 35 years. Our project is likely to be about a 30-year operations and maintenance period. And at the end, you've got your decommissioning. So in terms of what supply chain activity we're doing this year, as I mentioned before, we've just kicked off the onshore geotech activity. We're just finishing off our procurement phase for the offshore geotech and hoping to close that out shortly. Under our Energy Innovation Fund grant, we've got a task to do a local supply chain study, and the expressions of interest through the ICN Gateway will support that local supply chain study. We're also doing a skills and workforce study. So the work we're doing down in Morwell this week will support that workforce study and understand what we've got, what we need, and what kind of training and training requirements we would need to upskill people to be able to work in offshore wind. We're also going to be running some requests for information with the big package or the big contractors that are generally global contractors, probably on the call here today, to find out exactly how we can deliver this project and determine our final procurement strategy. And we are also in the process of starting to prepare our procurement documentation for our large package procurements. So it's going to be a busy year. And yeah, that was all from Star of the South.
Wow, thanks, Katrina. Lots of information there. That was really comprehensive. And of course, just to remind any Scottish companies who are on the line today that SDI are fully here in Australia to help you connect with people and sort of hold your hand, as it were, if you are interested in setting up in this market. So our last speaker is Tim Sawyer, who's the Managing Director for Australia for Scottish company Flotation Energy, who have a growing presence in Australia. And Tim's going to talk to you about setting up in Australia and also their proposed project in also in Gippsland in Victoria. Over to you, Tim.
Thank you, Linda. Thanks for the introduction. I'm actually sat with Linda in Melbourne here, having attended the Australian Offshore Wind Conference yesterday, the first time the offshore wind industry has actually got together as a group, with a lot of excitement as well. I was going to take you through a presentation and maybe start with how flotation energy came to be in Australia, how the journey we went through. Then a little bit on the Australian offshore wind market to build on what Katrina has said already, and Vanya. Flotation Energy is a company and the projects including that in Victoria as well. You might notice I'm English by background, that or my accent has tarnished somewhat. I've been here 16 years. Came over with RPS, actually a consulting firm, a long time ago, to set up a renewable energy business for RPS in Australia, which was a very, very difficult thing to do back then. But a lot has changed. Really, things have accelerated markedly over that period of time. And that brings us to where we are today, talking about offshore wind. When we first came here, we set up a company. I was based in Australia. So to set up, you need one Australian director. Obviously appointed accountants, work with SDI and Invest Victoria in particular to help us navigate some of the issues around setting up the company, put us in charge, in contact rather with some of the networks we needed to establish. And that obviously worked very well to accelerate things and identify other opportunities to work with different companies as well. We obviously then leveraged very heavily the incumbent oil and gas industry in Australia that operates oil and gas projects in the Northwest Shelf and the Bass Strait predominantly. That's 50 years worth of heritage. You do tend to come across a lot of Aberdeenshire folk at this end because of that, but it does give you a ready-made, part of the ready-made expertise and supply chain that supports oil and gas. And indeed, we've actually recruited a few people out of that industry into our Australian company here as well. So there is an established skill base. There are established consultancies, international consultancies here as well, and no doubt related industries and to those on the call today. It's worth maybe pointing out also the UK and Australia have just signed a free trade agreement in late December. That hopefully will make the transfer of personnel much easier, visas included, bringing people over. Australia doesn't have a whole heap of offshore wind experience by definition. It's a nascent industry. Star of the South is most certainly the most developed and has done really well with a team of 50. More and more expertise is required, and to do that, it's going to result in bringing some of that expertise across. We as a company are doing that, leveraging what is 55 people in flotation now, and all that experience in the UK and bringing that across here. And we also send people back across the UK for that training as well. So there's a number of reasons. Another benefits, I guess, with SDI, with Invest Victoria, which is part of Victoria government, in helping you with that journey. And I'd encourage you to get in contact with those running the session today. I'll very briefly then go on to the next part of the talk, the Australian offshore wind market. Katrina's covered some of this, some very small figures for you to attempt to try and read. Australia is a very big country, 4,500 odd kilometres across. I live in Western Australia, which is very remote, on a different electrical network, very different environmental issues there as well, compared to the West. 85% of the Australian population are within 50 kilometres of the coast. I think it's one of the most urbanised countries in the world, which means although we have a very big landmass, the vast majority of it is nowhere near where energy demand is, which is the urban centres, the main capital cities in particular. The figure you see at the top right is a very simple offshore wind resource map, 8 to 10 metres a second on average, give or take, more down in Tasmania in the bottom right. And then the lines are the different grid elements, if you like, where there's not a huge amount of large transmission necessarily that overlaps good offshore wind resource, and indeed those population centres as well. But that's part of the reason why offshore wind works, is your ability to put large scale renewable energy generation close to load centres, and to connect onto some very strong parts of the grid, largely driven by coal-fired generation. 75% of Australia's electrical generation is still coal. That's reducing very quickly, and therein lies a challenge: is how do you transition from a network that's dominated by coal into one that has to meet net zero targets by 2050, and indeed all the way down to state objectives to secure the grid, to open up jobs and economic investment. So that's some of the reasons anyway that are worth mentioning. But that transition is accelerating in a big way, particularly in the last 6 months. Others have touched on the Australian Commonwealth Government introducing the Offshore Electricity Infrastructure Act in 2021. The end of 2021, it passed through Parliament. The draft regulations that go with that are out for consultation until the 22nd of April. This is really the starting blocks. It's the starting gun to have the legislation there that allows the government to offer tenure in Commonwealth waters. That's outside 5 kilometres. And indeed the health, safety, environmental regulations that go with that, and the management scheme. So there's a lot of work to be done. It's very much the beginning, but a very positive sign. That process runs by applying for, well, designating areas. Commonwealth Government do that first. The first of those is the Gippsland Bass Strait region, which is where Star of the South are, down to the southeast of Australia there. Then once they've done that, feasibility licenses can be applied for and awarded under a set of merit criteria, and then you've got a period of 7 years to get yourself to a commercial license, which enables you then to go on and obviously build and operate. So yesterday's news by the Deputy Energy Minister, Tim Wilson, was very welcome, that the area of Bass Strait and Gippsland was that first declared area, and Star of the South is there, Flotation Energy's project's there as well, which is great. So we've got something to aim for. On top of that, the Australian Energy Market Operator, who run the vast majority of the energy market in Australia, released their latest integrated system plan in December. Before that was released in 2021 and 21, I guess it was coal will keep going till 2040, slow retirement, we'll have some more renewables, maybe a gas-led recovery, those sort of options. Fast forward to December 2021. Now the central scenario, the most likely future scenario for the development path of the electricity market in Australia is step change. That involves accelerated coal retirement. There's been a lot of retirements already, or there's been some already. There's been a lot announced most recently. The doubling of electricity demand that comes from electrification of the grid, amongst other elements. And really importantly, renewable energy growing from 15 gigawatts, I should say, not watts, to 140 gigawatts, which is a massive increase. The graph on the right shows how that's projected into 2050, with a fair percentage, 20% maybe from solar. The wind element there is about 25-30% projected, and various other generation capacities as well. But for Australia, which is a resource, a country blessed with huge resources, mining and oil and gas, to now be showing that as the government's central scenario, the most likely scenario, is a big push in the right direction to show that we are transitioning now to renewables and taking it very seriously. Vanya spoke before about Victoria government commitments, the first in Australia to make offshore wind commitments with their offshore wind policy directions paper, with 9 gigawatts by 2030 and more planned as well. 2 gigawatts by 2032, 4 gigawatts by 2035, 9 gigawatts by 2030. And the first part of that was the Energy Innovation Fund Round 1, which was $40 million pledged towards the 3 offshore wind projects you heard about earlier. So that's really a leading position. Add all of that together, and really offshore wind is up and running, I believe. It's on the starters block, so that's where it is. There's a lot to be done. but very exciting opportunity for those with expertise to come over here to establish themselves in Victoria, for example, and to help lead that transition. Next slide, please. Sorry, Kevin, I know how much you love next slide, please, so I'll try not to use it. Very briefly, Flotation Energy are a Scottish company, offshore wind developer specialising in floating wind and fixed. The team have developed 3,000 megawatts, 3 gigawatts of offshore wind to operation in the UK through, and the company is founded by Nicholl Stephen, Lord Nicholl Stephen, ex-deputy Prime Minister of Scotland, if you like, an energy minister, Alan McCaskill, who came out through BP and has been involved in offshore wind from a very, very early stage in some of those pioneering projects in the UK. With a proven track record in delivering projects and developing and delivering and forming long-lasting partnerships. The team developed the Kincardine floating offshore wind farm, which is 50 megawatts, 50 megawatts, the largest floating wind farm in the world. And I guess that really highlights the nature of the company. We take on challenging projects. We like to be early into market and do interesting things, which we're doing in Australia, of course. And we're pioneering the energy transition, really, which is a large part of that is decarbonising the oil and gas industry. That also potentially includes asset reuse, as a lot of those oil and gas assets come up for decommissioning. There's an opportunity there, and I'll come back to that. Large pipeline of projects around the world. You can see the map there, UK, and then I look after Japan, Taiwan, Australia. And our objective is to develop commercial projects, and indeed do that through local partnerships. And here to drive the development of an offshore wind industry. We are at the beginning of that journey. That doesn't just involve good projects, that does involve supply chain, that does involve bringing everyone along on that journey as well. Onward, please, Kevin. Lots of experience went through before. Some on the call will recognise Beatrice Offshore Demonstrator. I put that there because that's an example of offshore wind powering the Beatrice platform. Alan McCaskill developed that project, which I guess at the time was thought to be a crazy idea. It was the largest turbines installed, 5 megawatts, the first on jacket structures, the deepest water, all those kind of accolades. Yet from that, a 588 megawatt project grew out, which is the Beatrice Offshore Wind Farm. So from little things, big things most definitely grow. And I think that's what's happening in Australia and in particular Victoria as well. Onward, please, Kevin. Kincardine project, I think most people will know, and I'll very briefly mention it. 50 megawatts, 15 kilometres off the Aberdeen coast in 60 to 80 metres of water. 5 9.5 megawatt machines. They're the largest turbines installed. There are 10 megawatt machines as well, but they're the largest on floating structures by far. At the moment, 10 megawatt machines are installed globally, fixed or floating, and soon that will be 12 megawatts and onward up to larger structures. That brings us a lot of experience and lessons learned and a better view of how floating will emerge over time, and then hopefully down into Australia when the time is right. But our belief is very much bottom fixed is the first move in Australia. It's the more established, well-known technology. Next, good. Energy transition then is powering oil and gas. A good example, we won through with our partner Cobra to win a 480 megawatt bottom fixed offshore wind project just in the RSC there. Interesting, in round 4 bidding round, which was through the Crown Estate, BP, Macquarie, Total, RW won through in a big way with very large gigawatt scale projects and paying huge sums for the privilege, but in a market that is very mature, that has had lots of support mechanisms and arguably lower risks. There's a reason why that's happening, but there's the European oil and gas majors making a major move into offshore wind. The US and even Australian oil and gas companies definitely have not done that yet, but I think we'll see that shift, and that will only make things much more interesting around the world. Next slide, please. Asia Pacific portfolio with the 1.5 gigawatt Sea Dragon fixed project off the coast of Victoria, with option for floating in there as well. I'll come back to that shortly. 500 megawatt scalable project off Perth in Western Australia, which again is fixed. Different electricity market on that side of the coast, which if anyone's interested, I can talk about more later. floating projects in Taiwan and Japan, which are both emerging markets for floating in particular, with emerging supply chains, and an opportunity, I guess, for Australia to learn what's gone on in those countries, what's going on, and maybe to find other ways of doing things as well. And that includes that local content element. Next slide, please. I'm going to wrap up really with Sea Dragon. This is our 1.5 gigawatt bottom fixed project off Victoria. The map you see there is down in the southeast of Australia. And you see quite a couple of options offshore that we're looking at. One is a near shore bottom fixed project. The other is further offshore in amongst oil and gas infrastructure, which gives us the opportunity to look at asset reuse. That's not just the platforms that are out there. Bass Strait has 2/3 of the platforms installed in Australian waters, a lot of which are nearing decommissioning. It also has over half of the wells in Australia as well, so it's a big area of oil and gas activity. But we can leverage a lot of that, platforms, shore crossings, easements, personnel, port infrastructure, and we've taken on some of those people out of oil and gas, and they're happily settled into offshore wind, but obviously not all can make that transition. First power is aimed for 29-30, all things going well. We've been very busy with the environmental aspects, the stakeholder consultation side of things. We're moving through that process. We're now a team of 7, a smaller team that sort of suits the scale of the project. And you can see some other details in terms of what we're assuming for turbines and lifetime, etc. Significant because these projects are big infrastructure projects. They do offer new jobs, economic growth, and that asset repurposing as well, which is really what we need to be doing at this end. Connection into the Latrobe Valley, 50 to 75 kilometres inland. It's a long way, very, very strong part of the network where a lot of coal-fired generation is coming off. And working on solutions, and the map shows various routes we're looking at. Very pleased to have secured a partnership with Victoria Government on the first phase of that, through that grant funding that we've mentioned earlier. And lots more to come. So very happy to hear from people on the call and indeed local companies in Victoria and Australia on how we're going to move forward with the project. And I'll stop there. I think I've talked for long enough. There's a bit more on asset reuse that I can talk about, but very happy to hear. So maybe a couple of slides on gives you some contact details for myself. I look after the Australian operations as well as the Japanese and Taiwanese operations, and Carolyn Sanders is based in Melbourne here. She's our project development manager. So feel free to get in contact. Thank you very much for listening.
That was excellent, and I think, yeah, it's a really good point that we're very much regional here, so you can see how Australia connects with the rest of Asia Pacific, and for any companies setting up here, it's very much an Asian opportunity. So without further ado, I will work out if we've had any questions. The first one is about corporate PPAs. So the person asking the question is aware that Australia leads the world in this area already. So keen to learn more about how corporate PPAs will play a role in scaling up the financing of offshore wind. So would maybe Tim be able to, or Katrina?
Happy to start. Clearly, revenues are very important for any generation project. There are no tariffs that will be supported.
Tim, apologies. Can you, Tim, sorry, can you move closer to the laptop, please? It's not quite picking up your voice.
I was giving Linda her space. Revenue is very important, stating the obvious. Australia doesn't have tariffs for offshore wind, unlike maybe the UK with the various mechanisms it's gone through over the years in other countries. That's okay. That means we have to compete in the market. Merchant is unlikely to be supported offshore, so therefore corporate PPAs are going to be the go. On the NEM, there are private generators, and it's an open trading mechanism in terms of power. So they're going to be the default mechanism, is to secure corporate PPAs at a price that suits, and to do that over time.
Katrina, would you like to add anything from your point of view?
I think Tim's covered it. I think that's fine.
Okay, thanks, Tim. So next we have someone who's genuinely interested on this on a professional level. To what extent do contractors operate on the social license of a developer? Should tier 1 EPCI contractors, for instance, work towards securing, it's disappeared. Work towards securing their own social license too? So it's about social license. Should contractors operate on the social license of a developer? And should tier 1 EPC contractors work towards securing their own social license? So, yeah, maybe Katrina. Yeah.
I'm no social license expert, I'll put it out there, but in terms of what we expect out of our tier 1 contractors, the main thing they can deliver is local content and local jobs. So that's in terms of effort, that's where I would see people best place their efforts in finding local partners and being able to do skill transfer and technology transfer to local. So I'd say in terms of focus, that's good. Not destroying the social license of the proponent is always a good thing as well, and supporting the proponent. There's a number of plans that there's an Australian industry participation plan, there's local industry development plans for Victoria. So there's lots of different plans that need to be written, and to support the developer to produce those plans is also really key. So I would say that the tier 1s would usually support the proponent, but the best support they can give is local content.
Okay, so, and when you say local content, do you mean a company that has set up in either Victoria or preferably Gippsland, and they may have come from elsewhere to set up? That counts?
Yeah, so local content is defined as like the value add that is value add that's in the area. So even if it's an overseas company, if they're doing the work in Victoria or in Australia, that counts towards local content. Yeah.
Right.
So even if you import items but do a mod and you transport it to the site, that's still local content.
Okay, thanks. Yeah. Would you like to add anything about social
Oh, I'm
license?
happy to. Social license is important for all aspects of transmission lines on shore to putting things offshore. Australians have never seen offshore wind. There are no offshore wind turbines in Australia. As developers, we've got to work very hard on that and do the right thing from the off with how these projects developed. Supply chain wise, jobs are really important. When you've got coal by generation retiring, that means jobs are potentially going along with that. When you've got oil and gas decommissioning, there's a desire to obviously see more local businesses and opportunities. Victoria government are very hot on that. Perhaps Vanny can comment, and definitely want to see locals content supply chain. I think it's really important to the success of offshore wind. We can't be importing all that expertise. It doesn't work that way, and it certainly won't make for economic projects either.
Vanny, would you like to add anything?
Thank you, Linda and Katrina and Tim. I think the social license is part of a developer's responsibility. I think as projects are developed, we do expect genuine and meaningful engagement with local communities, stakeholders, etc. It is part of our it's part of a number of our processes, including our environmental approvals process and how we look at significant projects. So I think it is definitely something that when you come to Australia and indeed in Victoria, it is something that is looked at very seriously. These projects will have an impact. They're very significant. They're big, and as has been pointed out, they're novel as well. So we do expect a lot of we do expect developers to kind of do those engagements. What we also do understand is that these projects will often be a consortium, delivered as a consortium of people. And so I think that it becomes incumbent on the consortium to sort of coordinate that and to make sure that those issues are dealt with in a cohesive and systematic manner. And we see that not just in the energy sector, but we see that in our transport sector. We see that in our, in our hospital sector, in all of the areas where we are doing big infrastructure build. We are seeing these issues being dealt with both at a governmental level, but also at sort of that developer level as well. I hope that sort of, I didn't quite understand the question, but I hope that sort of goes some way to answering that question as well.
Okay, no, that's great, thank you. So do you see that ICN, there was another question about ICN Gateway, do you think that will be the best way for companies to register their interest for all of the projects, or is that up to each developer which way they're going to choose?
I think, Katrina, you might be able to answer this a little better. How are you guys, or Tim, how are you guys working with ICN? That's probably one for you guys.
I can speak for Star of the South. It's our main gateway. So the gateway was set up a couple of years ago. So suppliers have been registering interest over that time. So we've got a very close working relationship with ICN. They're very supportive and pointing us in the right direction. So I think ICN, it's a really useful tool for other proponents as well.
And is there a percentage of local content that Star of the South is aiming for?
So look, we're still investigating what's possible in Australia at the moment. So that's part of our investigations with our expressions of interest in our supply chain study that we're running this year. So that's something that it's a bit of a work in progress. There's a lot of components that make up an offshore wind farm, so we've got a lot of avenues to investigate.
No, that's great. Did you want to answer the ICN gateway as well, whether you've got that far?
I only echo what Katrina said. That's the default gateway. We're consulting with supply chain at the moment in the background. We're earlier stage, so we're not at the same point as Star of the South. So I would suggest that's most likely.
I mean, for any Scottish companies or UK or international companies that are on the call, I would recommend having a look at ICN Gateway because they operate in most states in Australia. And the Western Australian one in particular is very strong on energy projects. So everything sort of infrastructure, oil and gas, they'll be adding renewable projects, I'm sure, as they come on. So yeah, it is a really good way, not just of registering interest, but also of finding out some of the big projects that are happening around Australia. The South Australian one's very strong as well. So yeah, have a look. Sorry, the questions keep disappearing as Zoom chat zooms down. So do you feel there is enough qualified manpower resource for your projects? This is sort of a related question, really. And if not, do you expect the majority to come from existing sectors in Australia, such as oil and gas and conventional power? You've sort of touched on this with the transition from coal through to renewables, but
I can talk. We're this is part of our Energy Innovation Fund grant that we've received from Vanya's group. We're looking at workforce and looking to understand what we already have. And what our initial investigations are showing is that there's a lot of crossover, certainly with coal, heavy industry, boiler makers, fitters, turners, electricians, electrical, mechanical, dual trades. They all have roles in offshore winds. So what we're looking at is how can those people that have those base qualifications, what top-ups do they need to be able to work in offshore wind? We're also looking at oil and gas as well, because as Tim mentioned, that in the Bass Strait, Esso is starting to decommission a number of platforms in Bass Strait, so oil and gas is coming off as well. So we're looking at both those key sectors to see what we can get. Obviously, oil and gas has all the offshore experience, but yeah, so I think there's plenty of resource, but in terms of specific, there might be a few specific jobs where, you know, we don't yet have that skill set in Australia.
Yeah, I'd just repeat, I guess there is no offshore wind in Australia yet. So is there an abundance of expertise in offshore wind specifically? No. We'll need to do training for that. We'll need to bring in resources for broad expertise, and that includes suppliers that are qualified and be able to do the work. Offshore wind is not the same as oil and gas, clearly. And there is a crossover, but it's limited. And it's just about working out how we can enable that crossover to happen better then. So clearly those skills must be transferred, but ultimately, and it'll happen over time.
Yeah, we really need to talk to students still at school, really, and hopefully get them interested now in terms of the future generations for renewable energy. And those courses might well be in place by then, I guess. In a lot of the universities are doing great work already with planning. Vanya, would you like to comment on anything that's happening there in terms of skills required?
Yeah, so there are a number of pieces of work that we're doing both at a state government and at a federal government level. And so we have been undertaking a skills gap analysis for all of renewable energy industries in Victoria, and are looking to sort of map this out as part of developing, you know, not just offshore wind, but just developing a lot of new and emerging energy technologies. And then we're also working really closely with the federal government and the other states to look at this as a whole of country issue as well, because renewable energy sector is developing very fast. You know, Australia is moving through the energy transition at a really rapid pace, as you've heard today. And so this is a piece of work that we're doing. And we're really conscious that there will be skill sets that are not currently available. I mean, we are looking at it from a Victorian perspective, from sort of a short, medium and long-term perspective. And we are looking at sort of trades, you know, professional qualifications like engineering, but then also sort of industry qualifications like assessors, electrical assessors, etc. That there's a range of needs in emerging through sort of all of those areas, and we're really looking to map that and then pull together a strategy to sort of address some of that.
Fantastic. No, thank you. So in terms of manufacturing, this question often comes up in webinars, but does anyone anticipate that any components or such as fixed or floating foundations will be fabricated in Australia? Most European foundations are coming from Asia, so where do you think manufacturing and fabrication will happen?
I can talk to the fixed. So we've spoken to the local steel supply chain, and the monopiles that will be required for our project are just too large for current capability and even anticipated future capability. So that's not something that's on the local manufacturing radar at this point in time. Most of the tower sections are also too large with current and anticipated capability. Probably the best opportunity for local manufacturing is in the secondary steel items, in the platforms and the ladders and the other parts of the tower. So that's the feedback that I'm receiving from industry. I don't know if Tim's receiving anything different.
I think you're right. I think the largest rolled section is 5 meters from memory. And in Portland, there's pretty much one company doing that, and another doing it maybe on a part-time basis. So there's very limited capability to roll steel. It doesn't mean to say it can't be put in place. And then it's about enabling industry that makes sense. And if the bigger offshore wind is, the more realistic it becomes, the more the supply chain will invest in those solutions. At the moment, we've got some enabling legislation. We've got a very supportive state. We've got projects coming through. We need to work on that a bit more. the more projects that start to become reality, the more supply chain will invest and those capabilities can be expanded. Secondary steel, sure. Maybe if we're using jacket structures, there's a bit more of a potential there for them to be fabricated, but it's not really our bag at the moment. I think we've got to enable that to happen. You asked about floating, very different way of doing things, much more work in port. Potentially that modular approach to the foundation design, etc., may mean that you can open up the supply chain more locally, but it's all to be looked at. And I go back to what I said in the presentation, we're on the starting block, which is great, and it will happen quick, I hope.
Thank you. So any thoughts from anyone about construction vessels? So sourcing, the type and the availability.
So as part of, like, from our perspective, Star of the South, as part of our request for information process, we'll be doing a vessel availability assessment. We've already done one previously, but it's very hard to get information when you're not about to place an order. So look, we're going to assess the current availability the best we can for our anticipated project period. But needless to say, it's tight, is the general feedback, and expensive.
Specific construction vessels are in Europe and heading into Asia. We've got to tempt them down into Australian waters. Some of those will come down with the oil and gas, for example. Perhaps they're suitable for offshore wind, perhaps they're not. It goes back to the same point. The more credible projects that are being developed, the bigger the opportunity, then the supply chain will invest and we'll find ways to bring those vessels down and stay down here to deliver those projects. What I guess we don't want is, or not, so that's not right, but one project doesn't make an industry. It needs a number of projects. It needs them to flow one after the other, and for supply chain to have sight of that gives them confidence.
And I might just add that it is something that we are considering very seriously. We don't know the answers at this point in time, but it is something that we're going to be looking at really closely over the coming period as we do our further investigations. And it is something that we're interested in hearing from industry about as well. So for those people on the call who are interested in this space or who have expertise in this space, please do register for our industry consultation. We do want to talk to you about this.
I'll move close to the microphone now.
Thank you. Sorry, we feel like we're shouting, but we're obviously not. Just going back to that point about transition of worker competency, there is a comment in the Q&A that might be of interest to the developers and to government, that there's a major initiative going on in the UK to map the transition of worker competency from oil and gas, power and nuclear and other sectors, in fact, which could be valuable for Australia. So if that's of interest, then we can pass that on afterwards. I'm just going to.
That would be of interest, Linda.
Okay.
I would love to receive a link. Yeah.
Great. So Ian, please feel free to send that to me, and I can forward that on. I can't see any other questions in the chat. Can you see anything?
Oh, there's one on local content requirement in Australia. Perhaps that is.
We answered that one about the percentage. We're still.
I think there isn't one. It's a short answer, and we'll see as the industry builds.
Kevin, can you see anything more in your at your end in the chat? Oh, sorry, just one popped in for Vanya. How do people register? How do companies register for the industry consultation that you mentioned? You're still on mute there, Vanya.
Sorry, Linda. What I'll do is I'll send you the link, and perhaps we can share it with the attendees.
Fantastic. Thank you. That would be great. I can't see any more questions coming in. Yep, no, that looks like that's everything for now, but I'd really like to thank particularly the speakers for giving up your early evening to join us today. I know it's often difficult for the east coast of Australia to connect with the UK, but thank you so much for all that really valuable information. Tim here with me in the studio, and Vanya and Katrina dialing in. It's been really interesting to hear about what's already being done, and we are very much looking forward to seeing that the regulations pass through and be developed at both federal and state level. So thank you so much for your time. And for everyone on the call, please feel free to contact me or Kevin afterwards, and we'll try and connect you with the right people in market. So wherever you are in the world, whether it's have a lovely day or have a lovely evening or afternoon, thank you so much for joining us today, and we'll try and bring updates as it goes along through this journey in Australia.
Thank you all. Thanks, Linda. Thanks, Kevin.